Welcome to BioSignals, the podcast powered by BioCrossroads, where we decode the pulse of Indiana's life sciences sector. Each episode, we bring you the innovators, breakthroughs, and bold ideas shaping the future of health and science. Today's episode is essentially a greatest hits compilation of everything we've touched on so far since we launched BioSignals. You've got innovation, entrepreneurship, ecosystem building, venture capital, R&D, and a lot more. Today's guest is a jack of all trades, Derek Small. At his core, Derek is a builder. Over the course of his career, he's helped launch and scale numerous companies. He's worked across investment and operating roles and developed a deep understanding of what it takes to move an idea from concept to real-world impact. Today, through Luson Bioventures, he's focused on creating and supporting the next generation of life sciences companies, bringing together science, capital, and talent to turn promising ideas into scalable ventures. In this conversation, Derek and Vince will talk about what it really takes to build companies in the Midwest, how venture studios are changing the startup landscape, and what he thinks it takes to launch a successful idea. If you're interested in innovation, company building, or the future of this ecosystem, this is a conversation you definitely don't want to miss. Let's listen into the conversation between Derek Small and Vince Wong.
It's my pleasure to welcome Derek Small, who has been a serial entrepreneur and one of the most successful biotech founders and investors here in Indiana and frankly in Midwest. Someone I have had the pleasure and honor to call a friend for decades now, but it's also a member of the executive committee for BioCrossroads. So Derek, welcome to BioCrossroads. Great to have you on our show.
Thanks, Vince. It's awesome to be here, man.
Let's start with a little bit about your own personal journey. Tell us about kind of where you grew up and then a little bit about your early career trajectory that led you to be a kind of a serial biotech entrepreneur.
Yeah, well, I'm a Hoosier. I was born and raised in Indiana, small town northwest Indiana called Kentland, Indiana, and grew up small school situation. Really great and very smart mother, luckily, and father, and so I think pretty normal, Indiana upbringing, and went to Purdue University initially. Decided to change from that and ended up transferring to Franklin College, which is where I graduated from. Ultimately, not knowing what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
When I graduated, I think like a lot of people. My daughter's just now graduating from Purdue, and my son is going to be a senior next year at Purdue too. So, can relate a little bit to their challenges and kind of what they want to do with their career. I definitely did not know at that point either whether I wanted to be an engineer or whether I wanted to be in business. I mean, those were all things, that you don't necessarily know. Moved into kind of an investment banking strategy, venture capital approach that was more appeasing to my entrepreneurial interests. Tried starting a few tech companies too, and ended up working with a tech company, and then in 2002, I believe, maybe it was 2001, late 2001 or early 2002, I met a scientist from Indiana University named Don Durden. He was introduced to me by a friend of mine, and they were just asking if I could help them raise money and start a biotech company targeting cancer. And I had no idea what I was getting into, but that was really what started my journey into biotech, and where I like to say I got addicted to drugs, so to speak. I only focused on starting drug companies.
Yeah. Was that Semaphore? Was that first company?
It was originally called ComChem Technologies,
ComChem,
actually.
yeah.
We did a whole name change, branding thing, and changed it to what we later called Semaphore Pharmaceuticals.
I remember, I think it was probably 2001, sitting out on a patio of a restaurant, and you were walking me through your pitch deck. I remember,
It was horrible,
I
by the
distinctly
way.
remember that. You come a long way, as they say. So talk to me. You were at Semaphore for a couple of years, and then you moved on from there.
Well, I grew it really, honestly. So I grew up because at that point too, I think I was like 26 years old. I mean, it was pretty young for me, and I didn't know that I liked biotech or science. Frankly, I was a business guy working with a lot of great scientists. And at the time, I didn't realize how important the science was we were developing there. It was the first PI3 kinase inhibitor company, which now there's been probably 50 companies focusing on PI3 kinase. But at that point, we were the first. We were establishing all sorts of new experimentation to measure, how to modulate PI3 kinase, how to think about this in the context of cancer and treating cancer patients. And targeted therapy was not a thing yet either, by the way. That, imatinib or Gleevec wasn't approved until 2004.
Yeah.
So, and we were partnered with the same people who advanced imatinib in the Boston area. And so, that getting approved, I mean, it's just a cool time to be doing things. It was also really hard, to raise money. I think, there was a 21st Century Fund in Indiana at the time. Those were grant sources, and there were all sorts of ways that we put together, stitched together, whether it would, basically chewing gum and baling wire is usually a phrase that one of my science founders taught me about how to kind of put some of these biotechs together. That's totally what we were doing, because it was very hard to raise capital. And because it was so hard to raise capital, that forced all of us in the company. We had 5 people, I think, starting the company to do things that were not necessarily our training. So I ultimately ended up in writing business plans. I realized how important the drug development plan was for writing a business plan in biotech, and ended up taking over regulatory and clinical affairs for that company, and which is, of course, kind of silly. And I hope nobody would ever hire anybody like me for regulatory and clinical affairs going forward. But it worked out because we were able to bring in a bunch of really great experts and help me understand how to do drug development. And then essentially you write your business plan as a budget for that drug development plan, and how that would advance going forward.
That's what I've always appreciated about you, Derek. I've known you now here for over 20 years, and you've always had that intellectual curiosity and learning agility, right? So I think that's a key takeaway for the listeners, is people thinking of starting a company, is the criticality of being curious, and then also having the agility to really become the master a lot of different things in new domains, and not being afraid to go into those. And you're exhibit A of that. So after Summer 4, what was your next gig?
So yeah, we ended up, actually that's where I met a lot of my kind of Lilly cohort, including Richard DeMarchi, now that I've worked with several times. That was where I met your dad, actually, right at the end of that first point too. And as we were talking about new companies, but Gus Watanabe, that's where I met Gus, and actually what ultimately became the genesis of Bio Crossroads. And Ron Hendrickson was my CEO, and it just became so challenging. We decided to go and bring in a new CEO and try to transition the company. That's when I started Luson Bioventures, though, and just started to look at other technologies. I knew I wanted to be in biotech at that point, as I was addicted to drugs and drug companies, to start new drug companies. And that was when we started Norex and a company in New York and Purdue. It was actually it was intellectual property that was collaboratively discovered by a scientist at Purdue University, Don Bergstrom, and a scientist at Weill Cornell in New York, named Francis Barani, too. That company was called Cofiron. So that was in 2006, 2007, kind of transition time frame, start those companies and start to seed finance those companies. And that was my first really kind of neuro experience, and as well as some additional chemistry that we learned with those two companies and those two kind of scientific founders. Norex was up in Evanston at Northwestern.
Yeah, you've had a really blessed intersection with a lot of great scientific founders who've trusted you to be kind of their business founder. And it's really been cool to see how you've been able to just be around the hoop, if you will, and collaborate with some really world-class scientists, including, you talked about Richard DeMarchi. So now you've got you've had numerous companies along the way that you've had either IPO'd or acquired, and now you're driving the ship on a couple different key assets. Maybe let's talk first about Monument Biosciences.
Well, sure, yeah, and so just to transition a little bit from those neuroscience companies and Norex, which was acquired, and then we took a company public, which was really an Indiana company that we started called Assembly Biosciences. Science founder here in Indianapolis, or Indiana University, named Adam Zlotnick, and Adam is now still doing now the serial entrepreneur thing too. He has multiple new companies, and we had such a great time. It was a really fun time to be starting a biotech company, but it was a completely new science area for me. So um, that was, an important learning. It was an introduction by, Richard DeMarchi, and I often call Richard my E.F. Hutton because if anybody is old enough to know what that means,
When he speaks,
when
you
E.F.
listen,
Hutton
right?
speaks, people listen. That's kind of Richard DeMarchi's my E.F. Hutton. So when he tells me to do something, I usually try to go do it. And in this case, it was assembly, and we ended up spanning that company together, taking the public, doing a lot. I mean, I think we raised close to $1 billion for that company at a really heady time where it was a lot easier to raise capital. Um, but in that transition, and you mentioned Monument, I mean, there was a reason why I started Monument. And in the last couple of years of my time at Assembly, and this is, by the way, just to mention that, this is kind of like a rinse and repeat model for me where I hopefully can start companies with great scientists, build business, drug development cases, get them to a point where, maybe we can take the companies public or they might be acquired potentially too. But ultimately at a point where I bring in a new CEO to replace myself and then kind of do it again. And that's been the model now with several companies. And in this case, at Assembly, I knew it was coming up, but also we ended up having to, even though we were headquartered in Indianapolis officially, most of the research was in San Francisco at the time, and I was commuting, and that became challenging in and of itself. But also, I was primary care provider for my dad in this time frame too, and he ended up passing away at the end of an early onset kind of dementia complication in 2017. And that became when I really expedited the succession planning process. This is all now public record, because it was a public company too, and how we did these things, but, and brought in a new CEO there. And I dedicated, hopefully the rest of my career to neuroscience, drug discovery and development in Luson Bioventures. And that's where the idea of Monument, actually, there are two areas of my dad's, kind of ending clinical presentation that made it evident for me that I wanted to learn more about and see if it could be as connected in science as I could see in bedside in taking care of him was just this what I can only say is synaptic dysfunction, where you can just see when he would have these episodes and not have this cognitive capability. And it was a frontal temporal thing where actually it would be heavily episodic, where he could have multiple organ failure, have to be resuscitated. Frankly, unfortunately, it had to happen about 8 times in his last 2 years. And then you recover from that. And that recovery is like the ultimate presentation of the heavily, dysfunctioned neurodegeneration phenotype. So to see that, what you can see is like this, clearly there's no synaptic connectivity. And also what it looked like to me was a neuroinflammatory response that I just felt like we could make drugs to counter that. I just wanted to see what the science would be. So I partnered with our local friend, scientist leader here, Anant the Shaker, at that time, and really got, and some of my kind of crew from the Norix days and neuroscience, but also, frankly, Richard DeMarchi too, where he thinks deeply about neuroscience too, and came up with this strategy to focus on synaptic dysfunction and neuroinflammation. Synaptic dysfunction turned into this company called Syndeo, which I can touch on, but also neuroinflammation was Monument Biosciences. And Monument, actually, it didn't take long to start the Synapse company because there were just multiple kind of pathways where we could do that with either clinical stage assets that we felt some confidence in, a little bit more fundable, even in tough markets type of situation. So that was able to kind of get up and get going a little bit faster. And I was chairman initially there alone at a company called Gate Neurosciences. Monument, though, was harder because neuroinflammation is a new field and there's not as much solved about it. And everybody knows it's a problem, but nobody really has quite figured out how best to develop drugs for that. And so that was harder for me. I passed on multiple technologies and really interesting sciences to start companies. A few people ended up starting companies on those technologies. There's a company called Vigil Neurosciences, actually was one that I looked very closely at. Ultimately, that was a recent success story too. So I obviously had some misses in there, but to be a little bit more aggressive about that kind of science, I ended up finding locally here in Alan Palkowitz and Bruce Lamb and added, introduction by Anantha Shaker, I think around 2021 or 2022, was when I realized that actually under my nose the whole time is some of the best science in the world for next generation Alzheimer's drug discovery and development, focusing on neuroinflammation and some very specific kind of tauopathies, was right here. And so and then later I realized Alan and Bruce and Anantha had been putting together a massive grant-funded infrastructure that really was focused on developing novel drugs. It wasn't a typical academic, consortia infrastructure. It was actually, here's a guy in Alan Palkowitz who has 30 years of leadership experience at Eli Lilly, focusing specifically on translating early scientific research to novel drugs and testing them in the clinic. I think something like over 100, drugs that have done that, set the stage for Monument.
So I think you've really unlocked and tapped into really this powerful, I would say, kind of three-legged stool, right? Of kind of research, basic research coming out of Stark Neuroscience Center with Bruce Lamb's work, and then great translational work being done at the IBRI under Alan's leadership, and then you coming in with private capital in a startup company mindset to help accelerate those assets towards ultimately clinical impact. And so I think it's a great kind of recipe that is, and specifically in the area of neurodegenerative disease. I think we've got a real sweet spot here at in Indiana. Talk to me about where you see from a Alzheimer's perspective. It seems like for Alzheimer's, it reminds me like where we were maybe 15 years ago with cancer, where we used to think of cancer as one disease, and our understanding of the underlying disease biology was very monolithic. And now we know that it's hundreds of diseases. It's not one disease, and it feels like we're kind of entering that era with Alzheimer's, with especially with more and more ways to interrogate the disease biology and both not only through imaging but also through blood-based biomarkers. Maybe speak to me about how kind of Alzheimer's is becoming a more biomarker-informed disease and drug therapy development approach.
Yeah, I would say even what we touched on earlier. I mean, when imatinib was approved in 2004, 2005, one of those 2 years, I forget which exactly, but that was the first targeted therapy approval in cancer. And it was approved on a non-survival endpoint, first time. So it was a biomarker approval, progression-free survival, focused on, and you had to carry a FLT3 mutation in a gastrointestinal stromal tumor. So you're talking about, going from chemotherapy, treating all-comer, type of cancer to
Very
not
narrow
only narrowing down to just gastrointestinal stromal tumors, but a FLT3 mutation associated with that. That became really powerful, and now that just led the way to now we have, triple negative, all sorts of, genetic ways to define cancers and
GFR, RAS, ALK,
HER2.
Yeah.
I mean, so these become, but that was what kicked it off, was that Subpart H approval, which is a biomarker surrogate approval for clinical, otherwise, expected clinical outcome. And then next thing you know, we're off for the races to targeted therapy in cancer. I thought we were going to be there in Alzheimer's when because then if you directly apply that analogy, the first Subpart H approval was actually aducanumab in Alzheimer's disease. Unfortunately, all the rest of the data around aducanumab didn't really hold up to what the company was selling, so that became, a challenged credibility and a little bit of a false start, I think, on targeted therapy for Alzheimer's. But luckily, lecanemab was right there. Donanemab was right there. Those are the Lilly drug and the Biogen drugs that came right after that had stronger clinical benefit. Still the same biomarker movement that was used for approval. And there's some argument over, kind of what these things mean or how advanced that is. But at least it was moving the agency in the right direction to say, hey, we will accept surrogate, or we'll accept biomarker input for potential disease, impact for patients. And so I think it absolutely, it overlays in a pretty decent way to where cancer was back at the imatinib days. And unfortunately, I mean, there's even more, you know, neurodegenerative diseases than there are cancers, and there's more patients that have the disease, of course, and mental health and overall just diseases of aging, so to speak. So it's something that could really be life changing to finally identify biomarkers for approval. There's now been, I think, 3 or 4 not Alzheimer's specifically, like Huntington's disease was recently approved with tofersen, I think was the name of the drug from Denali, approved on a surrogate endpoint of neurofilament light. And I think there's one other, oh, it was lecanemab that was approved also on a surrogate endpoint with similar to aducanumab. So it's heading in that right direction. I think the FDA also has really tried to, there's so much more data to work with in neurodegenerative diseases. They've used that as almost a category to define different regulatory pathways. And there's these different, I won't get into super technical parts of some of these regulatory ideas, but there are, in addition to the surrogate subpart H, there's also subpart E, which is a biologically relevant movement in a biomarker, that's reasonably likely to move. There's different ways to get these things targeted in these diseases and get them approved in the agency now. So it feels like a pull, from the agency versus a wall that it was prior to these.
Yeah. I think what's cool about Indiana is like we've got, some leading diagnostics from a screening and diagnosis perspective being done at Roche Diagnostics, and then some leading
In your company too.
therapy development around. Lilly's got obviously a very robust portfolio of neuroscience assets and the work that your company's Monuments and Dale are doing, and the work that IBRI is doing. And so we've got real Stark Neuroscience Center, and we've really got it's really second to none ecosystem for Alzheimer's. And so I think that's going to be very, very exciting.
You're listening to BioSignals, the podcast powered by BioCrossroads. Let's get back to the conversation between Vince Wong and Derek Small.
Let me zoom out away from Alzheimer's, Derek, and talk about something you alluded to earlier. Just your transition of companies, of knowing when it's time for you to kind of step away and bring else another CEO in to a company that you founded. What are some of those hallmarks or signs where hey, it's time for me to step away, maybe bring someone else in and take the company forward?
Mm-hmm.
What are those signals for you?
Well, yeah, it's tough. I mean, it depends on, kind of where I was in my career for each of those transitions, frankly. I mean, the first one, honestly, was so challenged we had to. And it wasn't me. I wasn't the CEO of Semaphore in that first kind of experience with transitioning CEOs. We transitioned a few times. Actually, the current CEO of Bio, just so you know, John Crowley, was my first interim CEO at Semaphore. Helped us with the name change, created that whole dynamic. And he was here in Indiana quite frequently with the first times we were financing. And then it was Ron Henriksen. And then it just became, really challenging to raise capital. And that just kind of forces the hand, to timing these changes and thinking about, these different roles, because the CEO's job really is to raise capital for your company. And now that has to align with everything else scientifically that you want to accomplish. But if we can't raise capital as a company and I'm CEO, we got to make a move. So that's one reason.
Yeah. So it requires some humility, right?
Yeah.
On your side, it's like,
or
hey, something's not working, right?
I didn't have much choice in that case. I wasn't the CEO,
Yeah.
but I also didn't have much choice because it's a board's job. It's a board's role too. And I've now done that a few times in an external capacity. For me and then the next company, Norax, I mean, replacing myself at Norax was kind of a blessing. I had a really great executive chairman there. His name's Bill Gantz. And we had really good investors and we had a lot of success, but I was really young and and it was my first time being a CEO. And I probably pushed that one about as far as I could as CEO to needing to bring in my replacement. And I could feel it too. And I could just, there's just things that maybe I could have pushed through and been a little bit more Machiavellian, but it didn't feel right. So I actually had kind of like a very real conversation with Bill, who had been CEO of several biotechs, is one of the pillars of our industry, and honestly, the best boss I've ever had by far. And so we put together a plan. He walked me through how to kind of think of succession, how to think of what role we would be looking for, what would that mean to me afterwards. So I learned a lot from him in that actual a little bit more deliberate process. I had replaced myself, although right before that, at a company called Cofiron a few years before that. And that one was more because I needed to focus full time on Norex. So that was a progressive, proactive effort to bring in a new CEO. And that was a guy named Colin Goddard, who actually was that I brought in there, who had just sold his company OSI to somebody.
I think it was Pfizer.
No, they got the asset from Pfizer. They sold it to a Japanese company. I'm forgetting the name of it. Astellas.
Astellas, yes.
And it was actually a hostile takeover. And so he was a little disgruntled, but at the same time, kind of a great person to hand it off to. But honestly, it's been challenging, frankly. And then at Assembly, as I mentioned, it was when my dad passed away, I kind of expedited the succession process and these things that I'd learned over the previous settings. So for me, I think kind of like biotech, frankly, where we always want to have how do you be successful, right? What do you do to make a biotech successful? And people think that there's like a playbook.
Yeah.
And maybe there are some fundamental things to kind of do and think about in multiple situations as we think about case studies at, Northwestern or wherever we're talking about biotech best practices. But in my experience anyways, every company is so different. The timing's so different. The investors are so different. How they make decisions are different. How pharma considers different things. I mean, partnerships and stakeholders. So same thing with CEO succession is it's different, been different every time for me.
Yeah.
We did bring in a really, well-known CEO in to replace me at Assembly Biosciences. But, in each case, they're always very challenging.
Yeah.
And I think it's an important thing that I'm still learning. I'm
Yeah.
still learning how best to keep doing that.
Well, I hear the red thread through that is, and what's something I've always appreciated about you too is, Derek, is your self-awareness, and self-awareness, situational awareness, and also humility, as well. You've been immensely successful on a number of occasions, but you've always also stayed very grounded through it all, and and understand that different times may take different leadership, and that requires low ego. To be able to do that. Not many CEOs have that gift. So that's, I think, been really big part of your success as well. Maybe the last piece is, you've been around this ecosystem for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen it evolve and transform. Maybe share a couple highlights on how you think it's changed, and what role maybe BioCrossroads has played in that evolution, and maybe even the IBRI as well.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And I think, the first company was Indiana, right? Everyone after that for the next 10 or 15 years was not Indiana. I never moved. I commuted to Evanston, Chicago area for several years for Norex, commuted in New York for a couple of years for Cofiron. Once we launched Assembly, it was kind of a New York for a couple of years, and then to San Francisco. We launched a business in China. So Shanghai and Beijing, and did a lot of, kind of travel around, did clinical trials in Australia and stuff. So I definitely have seen these other environments, spent a lot of time in Cambridge, of course, too. We didn't launch an official business there, but I spent a lot of time there raising capital and working with partners. So, seeing all those different kind of ecosystems, it was really challenging initially to feel like we were going to be able to come back and start, more companies. I knew I was going to keep going, starting companies. And I knew I didn't want to keep, having to commute away from my family. So I just was really hoping, and it actually was. It was when David Johnson, at the CEO of BioCrossroads at the time, founding CEO of BioCrossroads, was talking with me. And actually, it was David, Richard DeMarchi, and myself up in our Assembly offices in Carmel. And he was talking about how, he thinks it's getting better. I had been around enough to feel like, okay, it is actually getting a little bit better. And actually maybe the first, almost 15 years before that has been what I kind of called like preparing the soil, right? I mean, it wasn't that we weren't doing anything. It just wasn't quite ready to grow the seeds,
Yeah.
because it also wasn't that we didn't have seeds, right? We had really good seeds of new potential company formation. It just becomes hard. Like it's hard for a really good, seed of a corn plant to grow in the desert, right? I mean, you have to have,
The good rich
good
soil.
Indiana
right?
rich
Yeah.
soil
Yes.
to grow good corn crop and so on. So that became a little bit more clear. We did not have IBRI yet. Well, we kind of we had IBRI. It was not like it is in its current form. And so, but those things were starting to feel like substrate. We had, Indosite was starting to actually become something more substantial. And kind of just that progress, was encouraging, and it felt like I was going to come home at one of these points. So I felt a little bit more, draw to that. And so I agreed to join the board then too with David, and that's been great. And as I mentioned, finally meeting Alan when this building was open, Alan Palkowitz, for what's going on with IBRI, knowing the seeds of what IBRI was supposed to be, right? I mean, essentially from day one, from Gus's and John's perspective, it was supposed to be essentially the Broad of the Midwest.
Yes.
They're very highly high integrity, high science translational research institute, focused, of course, on diabetes initially, but then growing into what it has now too, leveraging strengths. They're so smart. I mean, it was so smart, really, at the time, just really hard to pull off without the right leadership in place. And so with Alan coming in, I think that's turned a real corner. They've been, John and everybody around IBRI have been so good at getting the right resources, of course, the endowment and all the other, founding investors and government affiliated, leaders and groups have now, created this opportunity for us to have such a great translational research, high science institute. They're doing their own science, right? It's not just an incubator. They're doing their own science. They're doing their own, grant funded activities. They absolutely stand up to peer review. And now I think, in some areas, they're as good as any biotech company in the world at innovating.
Yeah.
Their
When their
approach.
industry-sponsored research collaboration kind of speak for themselves, right?
Absolutely.
An industry will vote with their feet, and they're voting by partnering with IBRI. So, I think really Alan and his team have done a great job of really beginning to bring the vision of IBRI to life.
Yeah,
So
well,
it's
and
been
that made it possible for us. So now we have two companies, Monument and Syndeo, are both located at IBRI. We have, lab space for Monument. We will have lab space for Syndeo. So, I mean, we didn't have any of that available to us 10 years ago to start companies. So I think that's a meaningful change. And, and then it's just getting started, right? I mean, IU Health, the new research center that's going up over there with Dennis Murphy and all that activity, the translational research we've been talking about. Lily's become much more, a part of actually helping things advance too. So
Yes.
Roche as well. And of course, all the One Health Initiative activities. And then Purdue, Indianapolis, IU, Indianapolis. I mean, all these investments, it's an exciting time to be starting biotech companies in Indianapolis.
Absolutely. And the newly launched identity, BioHeartland, right, is a great wrapper for all of this to allow us to effectively communicate all the exciting things that you've just inventoried here.
Yeah.
Throughout
Well, that's
the
because
world.
that's
So
a big problem. And you've done a great job, Vince, in really trying to capture some of these, like, what do we do well? Not only kind of functionally, you build up this kind of ability to really help biotech. This is all I hear from lots of people too, just so you know too. I mean, that feedback that they really feel like there's some place to get help now and starting companies,
Yeah.
resources, both outside and inside starting companies, and people looking at coming here. And I think that's powerful. And then now with the biggest problem is we're Midwestern, right? And we're Hoosiers, so we don't tend to advertise ourselves very well. This is an effort that I think can maybe start to finally get us out in a Hoosier respected way.
Yeah.
Get our message out about how we can be an RTP. We can be a major hub for advancing biotech.
Yep. Well, definitely. We are the BioHeartland, where bioscience solutions are invented, made, and moved. And you've been a big part of that and will continue to be a big part of that, Derek. So I really appreciate you joining us and telling a bit about your story here on BioSignals, and look forward to continuing to partner with you going forward and seeing all the incredible work that your teams at both Syndeo and Monument will continue forward. So thank you for your leadership and partnership. And thanks for joining us today.
Awesome, Vince. Thank you, man.
For more information about BioCrossroads, our events, programs, and how you can get involved, please visit biocrossroads.com.